Hello, everyone. My name is Lawrence Pasternak. I'm a professor in the philosophy department, and I am the director of religious studies here at OSU. Welcome this evening. This is our fourth and probably our final Zoom discussion for this semester. And tonight we have Chris Bennett, who is the director of the Soma Institute in British Columbia, Canada. It's a center for the study of entheogens, and if you're not familiar with that term, it pertains to plants used in religious ceremonies. Chris has been publishing on this topic for roughly 30 years and has authored or co-authored numerous books, including Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana in Magic and Religion, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, Cannabis and the Soma Solution, and Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. He has also contributed chapters in books such as Entheogens and the Development of Culture, Seeking the Sacred with Psychoactive Substances, and Cannabis and Spirituality. As many of you may know, today, April 20th, is actually International Cannabis Day, so the topic for this evening is quite an interesting coincidence, if we can say. I don't think we actually planned it to happen on this, but it just happened to work out with our schedules. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris to the evening discussion, and I pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lawrence, for inviting me to speak to your students and people checking out this program. And I think we'll have a pretty interesting discussion. I'm going to combine a bit of reading with a bit of free talking and show some images and stuff like that we've been talking about, and discuss some really interesting archaeological finds that have come up in the last few years regarding cannabis and its role. You know, today's 420, happy 420, everybody, so it's a very fitting day to discuss these things. Now, when most people think about the history of cannabis, I think they maybe think about the 60s or maybe go a little further back to the 30s and the reefer madness. But the reality is that cannabis is one of our oldest plant allies. In fact, Carl Sagan speculated that humanity first began cultivation when they started using cannabis, and agriculture began with cannabis. And he used the pygmies as an example, as the pygmies were basically hunter-gatherers until they began using cannabis ritually. Then they began planting it, and they would have little crops of it outside of their huts and things like that, right? And this is interesting because archaeologically, we know that humanity has a particularly long relationship with cannabis. And when we talk about fiber cannabis, Elizabeth Wayland Barber, who's probably the foremost authority on ancient textiles, has said that there are tools used for the breaking up of cannabis stalks for preparing fiber that are as old as 28,000 years ago. And there's rope that has been found from Czechoslovakia from 24,000 years ago that is thought to be prepared from cannabis, right? And now when we talk about ritual use, this is pretty old as well, right? And so what we're going to be talking about particularly in today's talk are a couple of different things. There's been some archaeology out of Arad, Jerusalem, showing that cannabis was burnt there as an incense. Found an altar and a little temple site, and I'll go into detail on this later. And we're going to be discussing that and how it interrelates with research I had been doing before the discovery of this archaeological evidence regarding the Hebrew term Kaneh Bosm, which the etymologist and linguist Sula Bennett first said in the 1930s was a Hebrew reference to cannabis that was mistranslated as calamus in modern translations of the Bible. And we're also going to be talking about archaeological evidence that's emerged for another sacrament from another part of the world. And in India, in ancient India, there was the Vedic religion. And they had a sacred drink, Soma. And there was a counterpart of this in Persia, in ancient Persia, in the Avestan religion. And it was there called Hayoma. And there's been a lot, we know that both of these religions, this one in Persia, the Vedic religion, and the Avestan religion, in the Avestan religion in Persia, the Vedic religion in India, that they both originated from the same earlier source because they're both Indo-European languages. And we're speaking an Indo-European language. This is the root language of many of today's modern languages. French, German, all sorts of European languages come from the same root source, Indo-European. This is very important when we get into discussing the roots of the Soma cult, right? And its interrelation to humanity. And what this was a sacred drink that was taken that inspired the people that wrote these texts. It was their holy sacrament, like the Eucharist, but psychoactive. And there's been a lot of speculation about what these plants were. Popularly in the Western world here, it's thought because of the work of R. Gordon Wasson, a mycologist, he suggested that this was a fly agaric mushroom preparation. And there's a lot of problems with Wasson's theory, in my opinion, and I've written about this. Because Soma is many things in the Vedas. It's a plant, it's a drink, it's a god, and it's also the moon in the sky. And as it waned, it was the sacred cup of Soma that the gods were drinking from. And as it filled up, it was being refilled. And many of the rituals regarding Soma were based around the moon, right? And so Wasson, he based his descriptions tying to the fly agaric on these references in the Vedas to the moon, which is a mistake because in the 10th mandala, there's a description of Soma, and it's pretty clear. And this is talking about the preparation of Soma, and this is from Wilson's 1928 translation. It's a very well-known translation of the Veda, but you'll find it's very similar in other translations. And it's talking about the preparation of Soma, which was done by crushing the plant with rocks before preparing the sacred drink. And even the stones used in the preparation were kind of invoked as deities. And this is from the Rig Veda 10.9.4. Let these stones speak, ye solid, quick-moving stones. You utter the noise of praise, full of Soma juice. They roar like 100, like 1,000 men. And they cry aloud with green-tinted faces. Obtaining the sacrifice, the pious stones partake of the sacrificial food. They speak. They received into their mouths the sweet Soma juice, chewing the branch of the purple tree. The Vocaria's bulls have bellowed, splitting but unsplit, O stones, enjoying the Soma, flowing green with Soma. They made heaven and earth resound with their clamor. The stones reclaim it with their clamor at the issue of the Soma juice. Like cultivators sowing seeds, the seed they devour, the Soma mix it and do not hurt it. Proclaim the praise of the stones which have effused the Soma juice. Let the honored stones revolve. So basically, they're talking about the stones going green from bashing it, and they also refer to it as the purple tree. These are colors of ripe cannabis indica, which come from the Hindu Kush mountains, you know what I mean? And this is in the same kind of region of the world that all this is taking place. And we see a similar situation with Hayoma. And the Yasnas are chapters or verses in the Avesta and the Vendita, which I'll refer to as another Avestan holy book. And it's pretty clear there that we're talking about a plant, a green leafy type of plant. Hayoma is golden green, according to Yasna 9.16. Hayoma is tall, according to Yasna 10.21. Hayoma has roots, stems, and branches, according to Yasna 10.5. Hayoma has a pliant stem, according to Yasna 9.16. Hayoma is fragrant, according to Yasna 10.4. Hayoma can be pressed, and this is the same type of pressing that we're talking about with these stones. They're pressing the Soma. Yasna 9.1. Hayoma has healing properties. Cannabis is a medicinal plant. Hayoma has aphrodisiacal qualities. Cannabis has a long history as an aphrodisiac. Now, there's a theory that this, here in this case, is the Syrian rue, and this is popularized by Flattery and Schwartz's well-known book, Hayoma and Harmelin, which is a rather excellent book in my opinion, although I disagree with the suggestion of Syrian rue because it has red seeds, and they're not talking about any seeds in any of this. They're talking about, preparing a green plant with green branches, right? So there's been a lot of theories about it, but I think that archaeological evidence that's been emerging in recent decades reveals that this was actually in its origins a cannabis preparation. Now, the Indo-Europeans, as I mentioned, were the root language of this common ancestry. And cannabis has a very, very long history with the Indo-Europeans. In fact, it goes back to what is referred to as the Proto-Indo-Europeans. So the Proto-Indo-Europeans is the group the Indo-Europeans formed out of before it split off into the various language groups that we know today as Indo-European language groups, right? And we've seen how old it was as a fiber, but ritual use of cannabis, it can be tied to Proto-Indo-European use, and this goes back to evidence from Romania from 5,500 years ago, where a little smoking cup, a brazier, a type of little bowl that cannabis was burnt into, was found at the site of a tomb. And again, we see this in the Ukraine region with a group known as the Sredeni Stog. And they found a similar bowl with burnt cannabis seeds in it going back 5,000 years. And this is right at the time period of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, right? And it's thought that the root word for cannabis is actually Proto-Indo-European and is canna, and that this has left traces in modern names for words for cannabis in different languages. It has that AN is what's really specific here. So we see this in cannabis, in English, chambra, in French, Hanf in German, sana in Sanskrit, banga in the Persian, and various aspects with the same AN. And this is how etymologists and linguists have traced this word back to the Proto-Indo-European and the Proto-Indo-European root canna. And so we see in the same region, they were actually burning cannabis ritually, right? And this was also the area of the world that people are thought to have domesticated the horse. And the horse is thought to have been domesticated by the technological advancement of rope making, which I discussed. There's evidence of hemp rope going back 24,000 years ago. And this allowed the corralling and the harnessing of the horse. And it's thought these same people, where there's evidence of burning cannabis, the Sredeni Stog, were that they also domesticated the horse. And this likely accounts for the spread of this. Now, this was, as I mentioned, 5,000, 5,500 years ago. And now I'm going to jump to some slides, and I'm going to discuss another culture. And so hopefully Ellen's paying attention and switches screens for me here. And we're going to be talking about a group that is known as the Scythians. Now, Scythians is a collective name for a variety of tribes that existed. So it's kind of confusing because there's just so many names involved, so they generally term them as Scythians. But they're a very interesting culture. The men and the women fought side by side in battle, They wore really exotic-looking armor like this, and they rode armored horses. What's interesting about them is they're an Indo-European group, right? And Herodotus, around 450 BC, he wrote about a Scythian funerary ritual in which they would throw cannabis seeds onto braziers. And then they would take these seeds and they would bring these braziers with the burning cannabis seeds into little tent-like structures that they would cover in order to inhale the fumes, right? And so this sort of thing here, right? And then there's this, here's an actual archaeological one that they found at the tombs. And these have been found at many tombs. This was thought to be mythology until the 1940s when Sergio Rudenko, a Russian archaeologist, actually found braziers and things like that were used for burning cannabis. These are drawings of the braziers and the stuff. And since then, it's been found at a number of other tombs. And this goes all the way with this culture into about 500 AD, where a princess in the Altai Mountains was discovered. They refer to as a Siberian Ice Maiden. And she was found with burnt cannabis seeds and these same sort of braziers, right? And so, at 500 AD, this puts it like 3,000 years later than the same sort of ritual practice that we were talking about with the Proto-Indo-Europeans that were their ancestors. Now, when people are talking about seeds, which is we see a lot in ancient texts and things like that, people burning seeds. Well, seeds aren't psychoactive, but it's important to remember that seeds were recovered with calyxes. And so they were indeed psychoactive. These are all pictures of seeds in their seed bracts, and you can see the resin glands there, right? And so it's pretty clear that that these burnt cannabis would have been psychoactive. Now, the Scythians didn't only smoke cannabis; they also drank it. And this is a bone cut that was found at a Scythian site that contained residues of cannabis. And this is a flask that was found with residues of cannabis. Flasks are generally used to hold wine or water or liquids, right? So it was just residues of it. And that's not the only find. They found gold cups that were used, and they contained both residues of both cannabis and opium in this case. And this is like a Scythian here, and one of these gold cups that contained residues of cannabis and opium, right? Now I'm going to switch back to my other screen here now, and hopefully Ellen's paying attention and can follow along. And what we're talking about there is a ritual use of cannabis with the Indo-European Scythians that's carried over from there. But this isn't the only place that this same ritual use carried on. And I'm going to return to the Scythians and that gold cup because it's part of this puzzle that we're talking about. But what we're going to discuss now is an Indo-European group that was living in China from about 2000 BC to about 200 BC when the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese, chased them out of the region. And they, as well, and we're also using cannabis. And cannabis has been found at a number of these people are referred to as the Jushi, and they're thought to have been speakers of the Tocharian language, which is a really old branch of the Indo-European language. In fact, it's as old as the branch that split off and became the Vedic Indians. They were referred to as the Aryans. These guys were the Tocharians, so they're kind of interrelated, and around the time period they split off from the wider Indo-European tribes, right? And so they have found both cannabis and another plant at this site here, Cannabis and Ephedra. And Ephedra is a very stimulating plant. In fact, it's the source of methamphetamine. The plant origins of, the base of it, and, ephedrine. And so they found, in regards to cannabis, at a number of tomes, they found a basket with over 2 pounds of female cannabis bouquet laid over, another tome with cannabis mixed with another plant, and they found ephedra tomes as well. And I'm going to switch to some pictures again here just to make things interesting. And this is some of the mummies. These were found in what's the Tian Shan Mountains and the Xianchang and other regions of China. And this has caused a lot of controversy because China likes to think that all their technology and history is purely homegrown. But this has shown that a number of Indo-European loanwords can be found in the Chinese language, that these people brought things like possibly horses and bronze making with them into China. It's caused a lot of debate. And it was only shown that they were Indo-European after DNA was smuggled out of the country. And they were shown to have Western European, Eastern European, Central Asian DNA, a real hodgepodge of stuff. It's very interesting. And this culture, the discovery of them because of artifacts there, like cowrie shells from India, has opened up the ideas behind the history of the Silk Road. Before it was thought to have gone only started about 200 BC. Now it's been put back more than 1,000 years before that, right? And so this is a basket that contained over 2 pounds of female cannabis. And this was cannabis that was grown and producing high resin content, grown for those purposes. And this is a bowl that was used for grinding it. This is a bouquet of cannabis that was laid over one of the bodies. This is samples from the basket that were found, and you can see there's still glands on some of the leaves and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the seeds didn't germinate, but they did try. And then they found at a number of sites, this is a map of these areas and these different tombs, that these different braziers were found at, you know, almost identical to Scythian braziers, except in this case they're made of wood. And but they were used in the identical way in funerary rituals. And so here they are again. These are the braziers. And now I'm going to come back for a little bit onto my screen here and reopen my notes. And okay, so how this interrelates to Soma. Now, as I mentioned, these guys came around the same time. And, you know, I should point out that in China, there's a history of, you know, long history of cannabis with indigenous Chinese, but around the same time period these guys were there, cannabis was picked up by Taoists and was used as an incense to see spirit, as an elixir of immortality, which is very similar to Soma. And they had a Chinese name for it, specifically to differentiate it from the more industrial type of application that had been being used there for millennia as well. And they referred to it as huma. And huma has been translated variously as fire hemp and Scythian hemp. And now this is referring to this type of cannabis these guys were burning, these jushi. And now the Scythians come into play here, right? Because the Scythians were deeply involved in this trade route aspect of this culture. They were allies of these people here. And they were in trade with another region of the world in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, there's a temple sites known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And I'm going to get into that because it's here that this term huma, traveling with the Scythians, becomes Heoma, and the beginning of our connection here with this world sacrament of the Eastern nations, right? And so it's interesting because one of the names of the Scythians in this region was the Heoma Varga. And this means Heoma gatherers. And ancient texts referred to how they both burnt and drank Heoma. So what they're talking about is this cannabis from these Tocharians living in China. It's adopted this name now, Huma. They've adopted from the Chinese for this particular strain of cannabis that they're using. And now it's going over into this temple site in Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And I'm going to share a screen again. Thank you, Ellen, for being so attentive to this. Now, this is a Russian archaeologist, Viktor Sarianati. And he is the discoverer of the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And he's sitting at the temple site here, one of the temple sites of the 3 temples. And this is a reconstruction of what one of these temples looked like. And half the temple site, he says, was for preparing the sacred drink, Heoma and Soma. He said 2 of the temples showed evidence of Cannabis and Ephedra. And one of the temples showed the use of opium. And I just want to point out in regards to this etymological connection that I'm talking about between, here I'll just go back full screen here again just to make things difficult, that this isn't my idea. Even before the discovery of these jushis or Gushi people, it's pronounced different ways, these Indo-Europeans, these Tocharians in China, there was a theory by the linguist and etymologist Mandy Hassan in his paper, Ephedra as Soma, meaning hemp fibers, with Soma later misidentified as the hemp plant itself. Very confusing title. And I'll read a quote from Mandy Hassan, and then I'll explain what he's talking about there and where I agree and disagree with his excellent work. Now, this is a quote from Mandy Hassan. The two medicinal plants, cannabis and ephedra, are given allied names in Chinese, cannabis, hua ma, and ephedra, ma hua. These names are mirror images of each other, and as such, next to being identical. The similarity of these names assumes that ephedra, ma hua, was discovered later than hemp, hua ma, and the ephedra was given the name of hemp itself. This is so because at the early stage, ephedra had no name of its own, so that the designation of hemp was transferred onto ephedra. Aryan ascetics must have come into contact with those of China, with the result that the Chinese names, Heoma for ephedra, as also its energizing properties, were communicated to their Aryan compatriots. As a result, Homa as Heoma is found in the Avesta, while Homa became Soma in Sanskrit. It is known that H mutates into S. This, in brief, is the etymology of the names of Heoma and Soma. It is natural to expect the plant would be known first, and later the names of the plant Soma would be transferred onto the juice, which is also called Soma. Okay, now, he's saying that the name comes from ephedra, but using the name of cannabis. And he's writing at a time before both the discovery, this is back in the early 80s, the discovery of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, and also before the discovery of these mummies in China, these Indo-European mummies in China, right, where they were using both cannabis and ephedra. And they do have a mirror relationship, almost a yin-yang kind of relationship, with one being a relaxing type of herb and one being a very energizing type of herb, right? So I agree that, largely he's right there, but there's no need to suggest that the name of cannabis was given to ephedra, and this was how it was adopted. He probably assumed this because ephedra is still used as Heoma. Heoma went through reforms later times under a prophet named Zoroaster, and changed the whole recipe and the whole rituals around it, right? And now they just use ephedra, and there's evidence of this in India as well in later times. But initially, they're talking about a cannabis and ephedra preparation. Now I'm going to go back to my slides there about the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. And I just want to make sure my images, yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm going back. Sorry about that. I just needed to make sure something. Okay, so we saw Victor Sarianati and the archaeological complex there. And Victor Sarianati, he uncovered a variety of tools that he said were for making the Heoma Soma beverages, right? And in this illustration here, we can see these were pipe cups, and they have eyes on them. They showed residues of opium, which was probably considered particularly visionary. But this device down here in the lower right, it was a filter device, and I'm going to show you a close-up of this. Here it is again, this filter device on the bottom, and they would use wool or some other sort of cloth and then filter the Heoma, all the herbs that they use, and let the liquid pour down, and they captured in these bowls, is what Sarianati suggested. Now this is interesting because we see the same technology thousands of years later. This is a painting from 1625. It's called Factors Prepare Bong. That's the larger painting there, and they're smoking cannabis, stripping cannabis from its stalk, grinding it up, and in the center there, they have a sieve. Very similar to that sieve there, right? And that's interesting because there was claims in the 19th century that Nazarite tribemen were still consuming cannabis as Soma or Heoma, right? And so Now, Victor Serenati, he claimed that in the spots for grinding cannabis, gypsum was left over, and there were impressions of seeds here. You see these on the lower side. This was a big pit that was used for grinding the Soma Heoma. And he said in the gypsum of this, the Russian scientists tested, and they found evidence of Cannabis and Ephedra, and then in later cases poppy, as well as these fossilized seeds. Now, unfortunately, Russian archaeologists are not as funded as North American or European archaeologists. And a lot of the materials that Serenati had found at the site were left to sit out in the sun. And years later, European researchers tried to reproduce results from the same sediment and were unable to. And this was attributed to being exposed to sunlight. And it became into dispute, and they disputed the sizes of the seed impressions. And this is a picture of the seed impressions here that they found, and you can see the very similar shape to cannabis seeds, right? And they said they're too small to be cannabis seeds, but that is not the case. And this is a picture of seeds in an American dime, and you can see the variation there. And these small ones are actually seeds recovered from a Scythian site. So probably part of the same sort of retinue, right? The preparation of Soma is very similar to the preparation of Bong in India. And this is the Indian god Shiva, who's associated with Soma in the Vedas and seems to have taken the place of the king of the gods, Indra, who was particularly associated with Soma in the myth of the churning of the ocean of milk. And it would take me a long time to explain that, so I'm not going to get into it. But this is a depiction of him crushing cannabis with a rock to make his own sacred drink, bhang, a sacred drink prepared in India. And this is them grinding bhang with a mortar and pestle and straining it and preparing it. All this has been seen by Indologists like Elaine Danilo and A.L. Bashram as very indicative of the process of making Soma as described in the Vedic literature and the pressing described in the Avestan. And this is leaked into the Nihang Sikhs as well. They're the guardians of the Sikh temple. And this large stick here he's holding is actually a pestle, and he's grinding cannabis for their sacred drink, Sukhadan. So there's elements of it that seem to have survived even after its disappearance in that time period. And there's a whole other story to be told about how it came to fall out of favor. And it also continued on even after the reforms of Zoroaster. We know that in Zoroastrian writings, they refer to drinking cannabis infused in wine now in the book of Ardu Viraf. And this is a Zoroastrian text, and it describes how the hero, Ardu Viraf, was given 7 golden cups of cannabis-infused wine, and while his body lay in sleep, he traveled to heaven and hell. And these are images of his voyage to hell from an ancient Persian manuscript. Another Zoroastrian figure drank the wine. This is King Vistaspa, and he had visions of the end of the world that influenced the book of Revelation in many ways. And this is a known thing about this book. It's called the Oracle of Hystaspius here because that's the Greek version of Vistaspa, right? And so this is pretty profound stuff. And I'm going to come back on screen here because when we're talking about the Vedic religion, this is like really influenced Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and we also see this influence of cannabis from these Jewish people on Taoism in China. And so, these are some major religions that are still around today that can be tied back to this. But here in the West, we're dealing with a whole other situation. And we're really influenced by the Bible. And I mentioned at the beginning of my talk this archaeological evidence emerging out of Israel from 2800 BC. They found a temple site thought to be a miniature version of the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem in a site called Arad, Jerusalem. And there were 2 altars at this site. And on one altar was burned frankincense, but on the other altar was burned cannabis resin. Now, this is very interesting to me because for decades prior to this, I had been suggesting that this Hebrew term, Kaneh Bosm, was a reference to cannabis. And people, oh, there's no cannabis in the Holy Land at this time. And no, that's not it. But this archaeological evidence fits seamlessly with the references to Kaneh Bosm. And I'm going to get into how this all fits together. And this is something, you know, the critics of this site are saying, well, this wasn't regular Hebrew worship. This was a heretical form of worship when they were worshiping other gods and goddesses within the temple. And that is true, and that's how cannabis became demonized. But the Kaneh Bosm references, they tell a different story. And it was very interesting to me when I first got into this, right? So this is, as I mentioned, this is largely due to the pioneering work of the etymologist and anthropologist Sula Bennett. And she was writing in Poland in the 1930s before the rise of Hitler about this term. And she said that this term appears in Exodus 30:23, Song of Songs 4:14, Isaiah 43:24, Ezekiel 27:19, and Jeremiah 6:20. Sometimes it's Kaneh Bosm, sometimes it's Kaneh, sometimes it's sweet-smelling Kaneh. And that what happened is when the Hebrew texts were translated into the Greek, there was a mistranslation that took place, and it was translated as calamus, and this mistranslation followed through in all later translations, although some translations use the term fragrant cane, which, as I'll explain, does kind of fit with what we're talking about here. And she showed that this was a reference to cannabis by tracing our modern term cannabis back through history, particularly through the Talmud, where it was referred to as Kaneh Bos, and tying it in with Assyrian references that are widely accepted as cannabis, in this term kanobu. And in the Assyrian references, it's used as a temple incense, an anointing oil, and as part of the sacred rites. And these are all, well-known Assyrian references, and very similar ritual contexts that the ancient Jews were using them in. Now, in the first of these references, as I mentioned, was Exodus 30:23. And God, who first appeared to Moses within a burning bush, commands Moses to make a holy anointing oil with about 6 pounds of this Kaneh Bosm mixed with myrrh and cinnamon and cassia into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time he is to speak to the Lord, he's to take this anointing oil, put it on his body, and your skin's a big organ, THC is fatty soluble, some THC can pass through, but he also takes some of this oil and he places it on the altar of incense, and he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. And this is the story of Exodus, you know what I mean? This is right in there. I'm not like, there's no stretches here, right? And now, so it becomes radically altered when you throw a psychoactive substance known to be burnt as an incense, like cannabis, into the tent of the meeting with Moses. And it's full of profound implications, which I'll get into later. Now, another reference, and this is like, so at this time, it's particularly praiseworthy, right? And now, the next reference, at first this anointing oil was just used for the high priests. But then when the Age of Kings happened, it was also used for the anointing of kings. And in the Song of Songs, which are attributed to a famous Israelite king, Solomon, that's where we're going to see our next reference. And in there we read, "You are a garden locked up, my sister, my bride. You are a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates, with choice fruits, with henna, nard and saffron, Kaneh Bosm and cinnamon, and every kind of incense tree, with myrrhs and aloes, and all the finest spices. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse! How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices." Beautiful piece of poetry, probably one of the prettiest things in the whole Old Testament. Now Marvin Pope, who was a great Semitic scholar, he said that this was actually a Jewish version of what was referred to as the Hieros Gamos, which means sacred marriage. And this was very common throughout the Near East, and particularly with a goddess like Ishtar, she would marry Tammuz, and this was all enacted out. And he said this was the Hebrew version of that. And now it's important to remember that Solomon is condemned in the Bible for burning incense on high to the Queen of Heaven, to the goddess. Now, interesting archaeological evidence has also been emerging in recent decades, testifying that originally, back in this time period, that Yahweh, that's the Jewish version of Jehovah, or the God of the Bible, Yahweh had a wife, and her name was Ashrae. And Ashrae was widely worshipped in Israel. We know this from artifacts, which I'll show you later, of her, the goddess Ashrae, but also inscriptions, which I'll show you images of later, which show Yahweh and his Ashrae, his wife. And this is the beginning of what becomes the problem with cannabis, is that in a later time period, by the people who were the kind of the final authors of the Old Testament books, the religion becomes monotheistic. That means the worship of one God. There were elements of this before, but it was mostly polytheistic. And even in the books of Kings and Chronicles, it refers to the Ashrae being inside the temple, right? And there was also the brazen serpent Moses made that was inside the temple. And it was destroyed during monotheistic reforms because people were burning incense to it. Imagine what kind of incense this was, right? Now, what's interesting about Ashrae is she has been connected with these same sort of cannabis incenses and ointments. And William M. Bowden, a botanist, wrote, there is a classic Greek term, cannabisism, which means to smoke cannabis. Cannabisism frequently took the form of inhaling vapors from an incense burner in which these resins were mixed with other resins, such as myrrh, balsam, frankincense, and perfumes. This is the manner of the shamanistic Ashrae priestesses of pre-Reformation Jerusalem, who anointed their skins with this mixture as well as burned it. Oh, just like they were doing there, right? And now Ashrae has been connected with the origins of other Near Eastern goddesses, such as Ishtar and Ishra, and these mother goddesses have likewise been connected with cannabis as well. Referring to the difficulties in deciphering plant identifications from the vague and long-forgotten names found in ancient texts, the respected Assyriologist Erica Reina reveals an interesting connection with the ancient world goddesses and Kanabu, a term identified with cannabis that few other Assyriologists have noted. The name of the herb called Sim Ashara aromatic of the goddess Ishtar, which is equated with the Akkadian Kanabu, cannabis, may indeed conjure up an aphrodisiac through the association with Ashera, goddess of love, and also calls to mind the plant called Kina Ishtar. And so she's basically saying that, cannabis was the perfume of Ishtar and Ashera. And this is a valuable piece of information when trying to understand the ritual practices and beliefs of ancient Mesopotamia, especially regarding the considerably widespread worship of goddesses such as Ishtar, Ashera, and Asherah. Curiously, few Assyriologists discuss the Kanabu references in the ancient cuneiform tablets, and when they do, it's usually with just a passing reference, such as Reiner's citation above. And, and to tell serious research, and that's what I want to, hats off to you people pursuing study like this, because there's a lot to be uncovered about entheogens in the ancient world, Now, one of the things about this altar site in Arad is that the critics who are condemning, it is the use of cannabis there, and this was even before the discovery of the cannabis resins when they found this site, because there was two altars and also two altar stones. They're saying that this was a site that was where Yahweh and Asherah were both worshipped side by side, right? And icons to Asherah have her often depicted as the tree of life. She's associated with the tree of life. And historians writing about this interesting aspect of history are saying the Garden of Eden mythology of Adam and Eve and the prohibited tree, which is one of the later things written. You can't take a look at the Bible as being written from beginning to end. It was put together and mismatched from different time periods, right? The Garden of Eden mythology as it appears in the Bible was likely written to demonize this worship of Asherah and her sacred tree. Sorry, my cat's getting in the computer there. Rian Eisler wrote in The Chalice of the Blade, like the tree of life, the tree of knowledge was a symbol associated with the goddess in earlier mythology. Groves of sacred trees were an integral part of the old religion. So were rites designed to induce worshippers into a consciousness receptive to the revelation of divine mystical truth, in which women officiated as priestesses of the goddess. And I want to point out that Sula Bennett, who initiated this research into Kaneh Bosm, she believed herself that the use of cannabis began earlier, what she referred to as the Matriarchal Circle, the time period when the goddess was more the dominant force worshipped, right? And now, interestingly, I mentioned Marvin H. Pope, who was a professor of Northwest Semitic languages at Yale University, and his book on the Song of Songs. And in reference to Ishtar and Tammuz, he writes this: the expert singers sit before her on the ground. Those who play, this is, okay, sorry, I'll start that again. The expert singers sit before her on the ground. Those who play the lyre, the harp, and the clappers. The kaburus who carry the spindle and the whip ease her mind with incense of fragrant reeds. The fragrant weeds with which the goddess inwards are soothed is presumably the same aromatic cane of Exodus 30:23, Jeremiah 6:20, Isaiah 43:24, Ezekiel 27:19, and the Song of Songs 4:14. These are the references to Kaneh Bosm. And he's saying that this exact same thing used to ease the goddess's mind, the fragrant reeds, fragrant cane, was the same plant that we're talking about here in these references, right? Now, the next reference we're going to take a look at is in Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel 27:19, we read, Danites and Greeks from Uzal brought your merchandise. They exchanged your wrought iron, cassia and canna for your wares. Now, this is interesting, as one of the things that they're pointing out about this archaeological evidence out of Israel is that cannabis wasn't grown there. This was an imported item. And as I talked about earlier in relation to Proto-Indo-Europeans and Indo-Europeans, the Proto-Indo-European root was Kaneh. The Indo-European root spread around by Scythians was Kaneh. As it came in as an item of trade with Scythian groups and other groups, it's important to remember there was a city in age in Israel, Scythopolis, named after Scythians. And we know they were in the area from various artifacts, right? That it came with that name. Now, that doesn't make a reference to Ezekiel using it, but there is an interesting reference to some sort of entheogen in Ezekiel, because in Ezekiel chapter 3, he's given a scroll by an angel. He takes it in his mouth. It tastes as sweet as honey. He swallows it, and it turns bitter in his stomach. And then he begins to prophesy. So it was only after he ingested these things that he began to prophesy, and he had his famous vision of the wheel. The next reference we're going to look at occurs in Isaiah. And this is another very interesting reference. In Isaiah 43:24, the Lord complains, Thou hast brought me no sweet cane, sweet-smelling cannabis, with money, neither hast thou filled me with the fat of thy sacrifices. But thou hast made me to serve with thy sins. Thou hast wearied me with thine iniquities. And so basically, Isaiah is showing up empty-handed here. One of the things about cannabis in this temple use was that the God spoke a lot better when the cannabis incense was burning, right? And God's not giving out any new revelation to Isaiah in this case, because he's showing up empty-handed. Luckily, at times, the temple was filled with smoke. And in Isaiah 6, we read, "And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the temple was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged." So basically, the seraphim goes over to the altar of incense and with tongs grabs a burning coal of the incense and holds it right up to Moses' mouth. And the iniquities, which God was saying, I'm not dealing with those iniquities earlier when he showed up empty-handed, they were taken away and his sin was purged, you know what I mean? So it's pretty clear that that's what did it. That's an important thing, because what's happening is there's a competition going on for this valuable trade item that's coming in from a foreign land. Same sort of trade item that was fueling the Soma and Haoma cults in India and Persia, right? A lot of people wanting this stuff. We're seeing its use in Assyria at this time as well, right? And so this comes to a head in Jeremiah 6:20. In Jeremiah 6:20 we read, "What do I care about incense of Sheba, or Kaneh from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me." Now this is during the peak of these monotheistic reforms. And I want to point out only two Hebrew kings were really monotheistic reformers, Hezekiah and Josiah, and they were grandfather and grandson. And most of them are worshiping the goddess alongside everybody else, burning incense to the Queen of Heaven, pouring out her drink offerings. This is all written about in both Kings and Chronicles, right? And we can be sure that it's this, that, you know, lack of it showing up at Yahweh's temple that's beginning to cause a lot of disfavor of this thing. And also at this time, it's important to remember that it's polytheistic. So there's other deities being worshipped in Israel as well. And, you know, in polytheistic kingdoms, whichever cult has the ear of the king, they're really in the power position. Now, at this time, Israel is starting to find itself attacked by a number of larger kingdoms, Assyria and Babylonia. And they're kind of feeling the need to politically solidify. And this may have contributed to the desire for monotheism. And there's a big thing that happens here when the book of Deuteronomy, the second book of the law, was said to be found in the Temple of Solomon. It caused these monotheistic reforms because what it's, you know, all the Deuteronomy is really focused on monotheism. Now, it's interesting because this was attributed to Moses, who during earlier reforms, his brazen serpent was destroyed because the people of Israel were burning incense to it. In the Temple of Solomon, a king that worshipped the goddess on high and burnt incense to her, right? And it's written in a style of Hebrew that's not from the time period that Moses was in. It's from this time period that it was discovered. And some people, historians, have speculated this may have been created to consolidate the kingdom, right? And it's through this that we see the suppression of both cannabis and the goddess. And we can be sure that this is what we're talking about. As in Jeremiah 44, this all really comes to a head. Now, Jeremiah here is over in Egypt, and he's talking to Jews who've escaped the attacks from the Assyrians and Babylonians and are living in exile in Egypt. And he's blaming them and their worship of the goddess for the fall of the kingdom, saying that if he'd worshipped Yahweh properly, that this never would have happened, right? And so this is from Jeremiah 44. "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, ye have seen all the evil that I have brought upon Jerusalem and upon all the cities of Judah. And behold, this day they are a desolation. Because of their wickedness, which they have committed to provoke me to anger, and that they wanted to burn incense and to serve other gods. Therefore now, wherefore commit ye this great evil against your souls, and that they provoke me to wrath with the works of your hands, burning incense unto other gods in the land of Egypt. Then all the men which knew that their wives had burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude even, all the people that dwelt in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, saying, As for the word that thou hast spoken unto us in the name of the Lord, we will not hearken unto thee, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goeth forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense to the Queen of heaven, and to pour drink offerings unto her, as we have done, and our fathers, our kings, and our princes in the city of Judah, and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. In their mind, the peak, times were like Solomon and stuff. This polytheistic worship was going on. They fell in this monotheistic period. Now, I want to point something out here, and and that is that the suppression of entheogens and cannabis is one thing that's full of theological implication. But the far greater crime against the religious life of humanity, in my opinion, is the suppression of the divine feminine, the counterpart of God, the balancing factor of the male-female relationship on the divine level, and the suppression of that and the effect that it's had on our mothers and our sisters and our grandmothers and our aunts and all women for thousands of years as second-class citizens. And women are clearly second-class citizens in the Old Testament text. They can be treated as possessions. So that's something I think is really important here. And I see the rise of cannabis, a plant growing for its feminine qualities, once celebrated in the ancient world as the very tree of life, a symbol of the goddess demonized in the myth of Eden. It's many ways a return of that same sort of feminine spirit. And there's a lot of really powerful women in the cannabis reform movement that I think materialize that in a very, very real way. Now, I could go on about how these were infused into wines and things like that by the time of Ezra, but I'm at an hour now, and I don't know if a lot of people, you probably want to ask some questions. I could also go on into early Christianity. It's important to remember, I think, that the Greek term Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew term Messiah that makes reference to this anointing oil. And Jesus baptizes none of his disciples, but he does send out his disciples with holy oil to cast out demons and heal the sick. And casting out demons in this time period likely made reference to treating somebody for epilepsy, which cannabis is very effective for. In fact, there's parents today that would testify to the miracle of cannabis in treating their children's untreatable epilepsy. But let's move it on to questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was like a whirlwind of information. Just, absolutely fascinating. Can
I show some slides first? Because I have slides of the temple site. I'll try to rush through them. Sorry, kind of a mad professor here. Okay, so I'm going to be showing some slides. This is the temple site in Arad. There you can see the incense. This one was where cannabis was burned. This was frankincense. And the altar stones there that have been thought to be Yahweh and his Ashrae. To give you some idea of how big this space there's a human perspective. This would have been an enclosed area, no bigger than a broom closet, so we can imagine it would have got smoky in there when they were burning cannabis incense. This is a inscription to Yahweh and his Ashrae, identifying Yahweh and Ashrae as a couple. Various other inscriptions. This is a depiction of Ashrae and goats eating from her as the sacred tree. These have been interpreted as wheat, but it could well be cannabis, I think. And this is one of the inscriptions of Yahweh and Ashrae, and here she is depicted as the sacred tree with the goats eating of her, as she was in her anthropomorphic form. This is a depiction illustrating the reforms, the monotheistic reforms, when the Ashraes were destroyed and the brazen serpent. And these are various books written about Ashrae as the wife of Yahweh, by the Hebrew goddess, by Raphael Patai. And this is a big topic with archaeologists and historians. And that's all the slides there. Thank you very much for letting me get that in. I just wanted to, it's always nice to see a picture of these things.
Yeah, it was something that I learned years ago as well. When I was at Yale doing religious studies, that's actually when I first learned that Old Testament time, so to speak, wasn't yet monotheistic. That Yahweh was the principal deity, but it wasn't until, I'm not quite sure when, 6th century BC or something in that ballpark, that finally Judaism became monotheistic in the sense that we think of it now. That was eye-opening to me. I have lots of questions, and the questions are open to the audience. You can see the text number on your screen, and please text questions. And as they're coming in, I have questions that I'd like to ask. And so my first question is that Exodus 30:23, the reference to Kaneh Bosm, and so for just the audience, the M sound at the end is what makes the word into a plural in Hebrew. And so they're talking about a certain quantity of stalks of cannabis or quantity of weight. And so it would be cannabis in the plural, Kaneh Bosm. So the word is even closer to cannabis than you might think when you have that M sound at the end. So question that I'm wondering about is 3rd century BC Septuagint, the translators who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, were they just unfamiliar with cannabis? Why is it that it became calamus?
It could have already been fallen, out of use by that time, and we're starting to see some breakup in the trade routes. I mentioned the Jushi getting chased out of China by the indigenous Han Chinese, right? And that's where a lot of this cannabis that was fueling the ancient world, I believe, was coming from via the Silk Road, right? So there may have been already fallen out of use through, this earlier stuff with Jeremiah and things like that. So they may well have not been very familiar with it. It may not have been intentional. There's the other idea that there was some sort of conspiracy. I kind of think I'm more on the line of unintentional. People, there's so many plants out there. You know what I mean? It's like just because you're translating stuff doesn't make you an expert botanist and stuff. And now there's even like, a few modern rabbis have accepted Kaneh Bosm as cannabis, right? Rabbi Ari Heyer was one of them in his book, The Living Torah. But there's always been debate about what the term identified. Calamus, lemongrass, different things have been suggested, right? Yeah. And so it's clear that even for them, the original identification was, had become somewhat confused over the intervening centuries, right? So I don't know that it was intentional, It could have been. I think more intentionally would be, the rise of the Roman Catholic Church and suppression of Gnosticism and pagan cults and how cannabis fell out there. With the Old Testament stuff, I'm not really sure. I think, a lot of stuff was at play there.
Yeah, my hypothesis is, and I don't know for sure, but my hypothesis is that the group who were doing the translation just simply were not familiar with cannabis. That, certainly, Jews roughly in that period were, because, it's in the Mishnah, it's in the Talmud, so a couple centuries later, but nevertheless, it doesn't appear out of nowhere. So some Jewish communities were familiar with it, but those individuals translating the Septuagint, it could have just been that they weren't. So that's one possibility. Let me move on to another question.
Let me just point out the Arad thing isn't the only archaeological evidence out of Israel. Yeah. There was also a find in 4th century AD in Bet Shemesh, Israel, where they found a tomb of a young girl who died during childbirth, but they've been using cannabis ointments and burning incense in trying to medicate.
Interesting. So my next question is a kind of more contemporary and political one. And so this is sort of the idea that cannabis was reserved to the priests and the kings, right? And so only priests, right, and then only monarchy were permitted to use cannabis. And so it was reserved for a few special folk to have these altered states of consciousness through which they could then connect with Yahweh, right? And maybe it had something to do with scarcity as well. But it also had to do with power, right? So what I'm wondering is now, we're in a place where Canada has fully legalized cannabis. Mexico is just about to. Almost 50% of the U.S. population is in states that have full access, another third with medical. So, the world is changing and it's becoming broadly available. And so scarcity does something, right? Scarcity raises the value of something, not just economically, but the significance and the meaning of something, right? So with the, immediate access to cannabis, I could drive down my street, less than a 2-minute drive away is a dispensary, right? To get something that 3,000 years ago would have been extraordinarily rare. And so given the abundance of it now, and given the sort of the cultural use, right, people going to concerts and smoking and so on, do you think that the overabundance of cannabis and its quote-unquote recreational or even party use of celebratory experiences, do you think that goes against its meaning religiously? Do you think that there's a tension there? Do you think it's sort of a violation of cannabis as a sacrament? Or do you see it as appropriate?
I should point out, I probably some people are thinking I'm an atheist after that presentation. But I had a very powerful spiritual experience that led me on this path researching this, and it had to do with a series of events that brought me to read the book of Revelation, and Revelations 22 particularly, where it says, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Now, not only was Ashrae connected with this tree of life, and it was her symbol, but there's a British archaeologist whose name escapes me right now. She's written a number of papers about sacred tree imagery and how it connects with cannabis use in the ancient world. And so, there's a real connection to that, right? And I think I kind of re-experienced a kind of an awakening. I think that the world's experiencing this as well. This thing's kind of going global. And I think, there's a real parallel with a biblical story and our relationship with it, in the Garden of Eden myth. There's the tree of knowledge, and God says, don't eat of that, for on the day you eat of that, you will die. But the crafty serpent, he says, you won't die. Is that what he said? No, he's lying. On that day, your eyes will become open, and you'll be able to distinguish good from evil. And we got to remember the reversal of that mythology in relation to this goddess worship of Ashrae, and the use of cannabis by these earlier goddess worshippers, right? And so that was kind of the story of our prohibition. You smoke that, it's the devil's weed. It's going to make you crazy. Right. And then we smoke it, and people start to go, hey, I'm questioning things, man. And they're looking at things like the Vietnam War and going, hey, this is crap, man. And they're looking at things like sexism and racism and going, this stuff's crap, man. And you can see cannabis even in the environmental movement, as a fueling factor behind things like Greenpeace. These guys were all heavy heads. I know one of the founders of Greenpeace was my family doctor, Lyle Thurston. Big pot person, lots of pot in the Greenpeace scene, even in the books about the history of Greenpeace, right? So all of these natural type of things are kind of emerging from the use of this plant, and I think in many ways that this is the return of that feminine energy, man, that, we cultivate cannabis for its female qualities specifically, right? And it's pushing a lot of these same sort of worldviews that were attributed to these ancient goddess cultures. And it's like we're coming to the end of this like patriarchal dominatory period, and we're at a time period where we could shift. We could go in two different directions. And this is where I think the fruits of the tree of life really come into fray. And what I mean by these fruits is I'm talking about things like being able to make paper from this plant. And it's estimated that 1 acre of hemp will produce as much paper as 20 acres of trees over 4 acres of trees over the same 20-year period. And that hemp can replace fossil fuels with biomass fuels. That we can move away from soil-depleting cotton that's ruining the ground farmlands and grow, organic cannabis. And we can feed the world's hungry with its seeds. And when I'm talking about healing leaves, I'm talking about a medicine that is healing things like epilepsy, glaucoma, helping people with cancer and countless other ailments. In fact, cannabis medicine has revolutionized the medical field by the discovery of the endocannabinoid system and how it relates to the aspect of human health. And now we have this religious material coming out of the desert sand. And when we're talking about Soma and Hayoma and Judaism and the religions that grew out of them, we're talking about the leading religions of the world today. Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Sikhism, Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism can all be tied in with cannabis. And I could go off at length. We could do like 10, 15 shows like this about all these different religions and the same sort of historical presentation of evidence, right? So this is a reality now. And I want to say that this is a type of paradigm shift that Darwin's theory of evolution offered in revisioning the myths of Genesis and the creation of Adam and Eve, because what it reveals is the plant-based shamanic origins of the world's religions. And that puts humanity back in the power seat, man. We can stop worshiping the gods in the sky and start looking within again.
So maybe one thing in terms of the religious significance of cannabis is, and you're probably familiar with this, maybe you're not, but that functional MRI studies have shown that cannabis increases right hemisphere activity. And so the right hemisphere is responsible for creativity, for associational thinking. The left hemisphere is responsible for more ordered, logical thinking. And so the kind of inspiration that one could get by amplifying the right hemisphere is one that's kind of conducive, right, to these altered states and religious inspiration and so on. But as well as that, with regards to the issue of healing, what you could say is that we live in a world that's very left hemisphere biased, right?
Yeah.
Order and rules, checking your watch, keeping track of time, schedules, calendars, everything is organized, right? You have to follow these, your daily planners and everything. Cannabis is the opposite of that. Right? So, if we live in this left hemisphere biased world and we're introducing something to increase right hemisphere activity, you could say that the world is out of balance. And then this is, right, a way of offering people a way to find a new kind of balance in their life. So when you get back to the issue,
very interesting, and I agree. And there's another aspect to that, my last book, Liber 420, dealt a lot with alchemy and, things like the marriage of the sun and the moon. And I want to point out that there's actual references to cannabis in medieval alchemical texts, right? So it's not like a theory that alchemists were using cannabis. It's actual references. Paracelsus, Avicenna, Cardano, and other alchemists wrote about it and wrote about making tinctures or quintessences. Now, one of the things that a lot of people that use a lot of cannabis report is that they dream very little, right? And this is sometimes sought after because it's good for PTSD, which can have a lot of bad dreams. You don't really want to dream so much, right? Now, in the 80s, they were doing tests on research on cannabis and melatonin. And they found that daytime levels of melatonin could be spiked as much as 2,000 times the normal daytime level upon smoking some cannabis. So that's quite a huge spike, and so it's probably this daytime use that is where melatonin is spiking that accounts for the fewer dreams of heavy users of cannabis. Now I've noticed this other effect. A couple of times I've woken up in the middle of the night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and I've smoked some cannabis, gone back to sleep, and had the most vivid interactive dreams that I've ever had. And I'm attributing this to the same spike of melatonin, which plays a huge role in dreaming. And this is very interesting in relation to how cannabis has played a role in as an entheogen and in magic, where it was often used with magic mirrors. There's grimoires, numbers of grimoires from the 16th century referring to cannabis to be used for seeing visions in magic mirrors. And in the 19th century, there was a numbers of occultists like Pascal Beverly Randolph and Alphonse Cahagnet that were using cannabis in the same way with magic mirrors, right? And they would use cannabis and they'd stare into a mirror, and then slowly something would come and talk back out to them. Now, what was that? You know what I mean? And now in the 19th century, Le Club de Hashishins, the Hashish Club, which had luminaries like Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Gerard de Nerval, writers whose books are classics today and still in print. It also had a member, Dr. J.J. Moreau, and he was one of the founders of Le Club de Hashishin, the Hashish Club. And he was particularly interested in cannabis because he thought it might answer something about insanity. And he thought that cannabis mimicked the dream state, which he saw as kind of an insanity of the night, and also insanity, and hope to learn more about that. And this is where we begin to get to these concept of the unconscious and the subconscious. And I based my conclusion in Liber 420 around evidence showing it with other later researchers after Moreau, the development of the unconscious and subconscious through this. In fact, Carl Jung, he actually gave a lecture on Gerard de Nerval, one of the members of the Hashish Club, showing the dangers of how if the unconscious or subconscious raises up too fast, that insanity could result. And he probably attributed this to de Nerval's use of hashish. He was quite a copious user. Now, what I think we're talking about here is the marriage of the sun and the moon. The sun is like our daytime awake present consciousness, and the moon is like our silver poetic consciousness. The one that tells us our dreams at night was the one that spoke from the mirrors to the magicians and alchemists. And that was a technology used to kind of bring that interaction out. And it's when you marry the sun and the moon together that genius rises, you know what I mean? And so that's something to be sought after. Takes some work, takes some planning, you know what I mean? And I think when a lot of people that are overrun with anxiety and stuff, when they use cannabis, what's happened is the door to the unconscious, the basement's opened up too quick, and they're getting flooded with thoughts that they've been trying to keep hammered shut down there, you know what I mean? So it was a very, very interesting analogy, and you can use cannabis to that end. I think yoga is kind of a similar type of process. We see cannabis used with yoga as well.
So next question. There are lots of entheogens out there, peyote and hallucinogenic mushrooms and ayahuasca. Do you think there's something kind of special about cannabis? Do you like if you were to sort of think about how cannabis differs, its meaning or its effect,
I think cannabis
religious
yeah, I think it's kind of an ambassador for these other plants. You know what I mean? It has this incredible history for us, particularly, you know, in the West, and believing in the Bible and this stuff from Soma and Haoma. So for me, it's got a particular interest. But there's no doubt that these other substances were holy substances. You know, and you got to remember, after they became lost in these Abrahamic traditions, that followers of the Abrahamic tradition smashed the use of these substances wherever they came into contact with them, whether it be at the rise of Christianity with the Catholic Church and the suppression of Gnostic Christian sects that use it and pagan sects that used a variety of entheogens, or medieval witches that used varieties of herbs, a lot of nightshades and stuff like that, and their persecution, or over here in the New World where peyote users and ayahuasca users and sacred mushroom users were all demonized and their sacraments condemned as devil worship. You know what I mean? And I think that's a real powerful thing that the Bible started in that same sort of plant-based shamanism. But I think that these plants are like right here for humanity right now to lead us back to Mother Earth, man, to show us the way back into Eden, to remove the flaming cherubim, to open up the gates of Eden.
So next question. This seems also kind of like this weird accident of history, in that the cannabis of the Near East and Central Asia had psychoactive properties. But then when the Romans acquired it for industrial purposes, for rope and for linen and so on, the cannabis sativa that came to be grown in Europe had no psychoactivity. Like, is that just a strange coincidence? Is there anything?
A lot of it's probably climate related and what they were growing it for, the purposes behind it. You know, Robert Hooke, who was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy, he actually came up with the term Indian hemp to distinguish it from the European hemp that was actually inert. And that all came out of this same magical and alchemy type of stuff that I was talking about. I mentioned how cannabis was in of 16th century magical grimoires. Well, one of the founders of the Royal Society was Isaac Ashmole, also an important figure in Freemasonry. He left his name in some of those grimoires with these cannabis recipes in it. And these were in use at the time of Dr. John Dee. And both Hooke and Ashmole had deep interest in John Dee and were reading all these grimoires and seeing these references to cannabis. There's indication that cannabis and other drugs, probably opium, were used by John Dee and Edward Kelly. And the main founder of the Royal Society, Robert Boyle, he wrote about Egyptian delicacies for having dreams, and the fungus referred to by the French author, referring to some sort of mushroom preparation, possibly a reference to agaric mushrooms in Gargantua and Pantagruel by the French author Rabelais is what I'm thinking, where there's also hidden references to cannabis. So he's the father of modern chemistry, and he's talking about visionary herbs, and they're trying to understand how these things work. We're getting to see how even at the birth of science, the Royal Academy, where alchemy and magic go out the door and science is born, Hooke's giving 2 lectures about cannabis. Ashmole, one of the founders, has his name written in texts like the Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, which has cannabis recipes, and the main founder, Robert Boyle, is talking about the Egyptian delicacies, which are likely some sort of dawamask or majoun, one of these hashish-infused treats from the Middle East, and funguses for seeing visions. You know, so that's pretty powerful, even in the Isles of Science, that we're beginning to see this stuff and the role it's played.
So, you know, we've been talking for over an hour about the religious history of cannabis. And as obviously you know, you and I have discussed this, there's something in the order of 15 or 20 cannabis churches throughout North America. So stretching West Coast, East Coast, from Florida up to Canada. There's, you know, in states that have fully legal cannabis and states that still have full prohibition. All around North America, there are these cannabis churches. And decades ago, there were attempts to get First Amendment protection to legalize religious use of cannabis, and that got denied based upon basically public interest, that they just felt like it would open the door to widespread use. But we now have widespread use. You know, we have widespread use. 50% of the whole population is in states with recreational use. So the argument, right, to oppose First Amendment protection is basically gone now. And I don't see anywhere any churches trying to argue that First Amendment claim again, like actively with a case. But are you aware of any cases where that actively is going on?
Well, I'm taking it that you don't know that I had a case here in Canada in federal court.
I do know that, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I was a member of the Church of the Universe since about 1991, and we recognized cannabis tree of life. Same argument. I presented evidence with affidavits from 3 professors who were familiar with my research, other evidence, and I was denied on the public interest, like you're talking about these guys. And then a couple of years later, we legalized federally. You know, I actually was able to challenge the decision, and I could have gone back to court because the judge cut and pasted the arguments against me and used them for his decision. So he didn't do the proper thinking it through, and I would have won based on evidence, right? But after we legalized, I didn't really see the point in pursuing it further. I think there is a case, particularly now with this evidence out of Arad and this archaeological material that we've been discussing. It's clearly been a part of human history. I think even beyond the religious use aspect. We're talking about a plant here with like tens of thousands of years of evidence of use and interrelationship with humanity that's played an important religious role. So we're talking about indigenous relationships, like our relationships to air and water and the earth we live on, man. And so it goes beyond religious rights to natural rights. And that's what we're really talking about here, is natural rights.
Yep. Yeah, I often present this in terms of a natural right to have control over one's body and a natural right to have control over one's mind. And so when one talks about issues of prohibition, you know, the government tries to balance off our rights against public interest. But we're obviously seeing now throughout North America and progressively through the world, there's a lot of Americans don't realize that cannabis in one form or another is legal for medical purposes in about 50 countries. Yeah. The United States is way behind the rest of the world. 50 countries around the world have already legalized cannabis for medical purposes. And we can't even get a banking bill to go through, right? So, you know, all these questions are coming from me. I'm not sure if there's a glitch with the texting today, or maybe people are just intimidated by this. We normally get a good number of questions. But we have a few minutes left. If anybody wants to text in a question, now's your chance. But let me just ask one more question, since I'm still waiting for questions from anyone else. And so the last question is, I just mentioned that, you know, there's 15 or 20 different cannabis churches around. And maybe part of what might be needed if these churches wanted to get a First Amendment protection is for them to have a synod or a council, right? So all these disparate churches that really don't interact with one another, if there was like a national convention of cannabis churches or something like that, to come up with some basic platform. And I don't know if you're aware of there being any attempts along those lines.
There has been attempts. You know, there was a mail list about 15 years ago that had a bunch of the main players in the scene that were around then: Roger Christie, Tom Brown, and some of these other figures. Chris Conrad and Mickey Norris, they have some sort of a list going, and there is like, you know, they're tied in with some other groups and stuff like that. They may be good people to get into contact with if you want to expand on that. It can go, but, you know, a lot of times, unfortunately, you know, getting people to work together is like herding cats a lot of times. And it can also get fairly explosive, because when you get into things like religion, people are very attached to their particular religious views a lot of times. So, you know, if you can find some sort of like consolidating ground and you can frame it around that, it's possible. And it could well become a powerful force. I don't know, like, you know, where this is all going. I would say the prohibition, what remains of it, is largely due to Christian influences, evangelical and things like that. And many evangelicals see cannabis and entheogens particularly wicked, as in the book of Revelation, the references to sorcery are from this Greek term pharmakia, which refers to the magical use of such substances, right? And so anything that is going to be taking place in that regard, and once it gets to a certain point and the reactions start coming in, that's going to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, I think as well is it's sort of like an entrenched ideology, right? That so much of the left versus right, there are a couple sort of key points of disagreement: abortion and drug legalization. For decades and decades, it's defined the left-right division. And so the extent to which the right is willing to give up ground with regard to cannabis is a concession that they were wrong all these years, right, to prohibit it, and wrong, and the guilt is on their shoulders for the tens of millions of people whose lives have been damaged due to prohibition. So, you know, I think that in addition to a value system, there's also just the weight of, you know, whatever, 50 years, right, of the so-called war on drugs, and acknowledging that that has been worse than a debacle. Debacle is too weak of a word for it.
You know, it's, I think you go far, right? You find a lot of advocates. Libertarians are well-known advocates for legalization. And, you know, we've got Democrat in now, and, you know, Biden, his heart's not in legalization, you know what I mean? He's like an 80s school teacher, counselor, or something like that, and drugs are bad, okay? So there's a mixed match in both parties. I'd say definitely it's much more of a democratic issue, though.
Yeah, true. And, here in Oklahoma, we're very deep red state, but the kind of red that we have here has a bigger strand of libertarianism than a lot of other red states. And that's at least part of the reason why we have, among all the red states, been able to legalize, and why we have such an open program, right, within the context of a medical program. A lot of it has to do with the libertarian aspect of both the general public here, as well as our lawmakers being willing to allow this program to expand. Because you think about Utah, right? In Utah, there was a citizen initiative that legalized cannabis, and then the lawmakers just removed it and put in their own, right? But here, right, the anti-government, give everybody their liberty position is shared. At least there are enough people at our capital that see things that way. Yeah. I'm very much surprised that we've not had a... Sorry?
Oh, I was going to say, when I first became an activist here in British Columbia, it was a long time before I even met any other cannabis activists. And now on the street I live on, there's a $20 million factory growing cannabis and magic mushrooms legally, and that's how far things have come here in my time as an activist. Yeah. Well,
slowly things are changing here. I don't know whether or not federally we're going to see legalization or not under Biden. I sometimes I'm optimistic, but it's hard to hold on thinking that he seems against it, and how do you get it through the Senate? And it's sort of this dam that if that changes, if cannabis prohibition ends, then how much more quickly after that might we see things like hallucinogenic mushrooms and something like that coming along the line? It's like holding everything back, arguably. It's that, it's the gateway. Cannabis is in a sense the gateway to further legalization. And that's something probably people are aware of too, who are resistant to it.
Yeah. It's a paradigm shift for sure. And I think there's a lot of magic at work. And I think in regards to cannabis, the best is yet to come. There's going to be more stuff happening around this, and its religious use and its history. Yeah. And there's magic. And the science and the medicine, right? That,
basically politicians have suppressed cannabis science for 50 years. And the amount of knowledge that we could have gained over those 50 years if it wasn't suppressed would be enormous. So there's a lot to learn. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm sure that we had a lot of viewers, but nobody wanted to send us questions. But nevertheless, I really appreciate your coming in this evening, and maybe we could do something like this again next year.
Absolutely. There's always lots to talk about. We could talk about how Jesus was one of the first cannabis activists or something like that. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for having me, Lawrence, and happy 420, everybody.